Donald Trump has officially won the White House, and the stock market loved it. We saw the Dow Jones jump by more than 1,000%. Bitcoin broke a new record high. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac both jumped up by more than 30% because Wall Street is hoping that the new presidential administration is going to stimulate the economy and the White House. Now, what I want to do in this video is not talk about politics or policy or geopolitics. Instead, I want to focus on you and your money, because now that the election's over, I want you to get more focused in on your house instead of the White House. And that's why in this video, I want to go over what Wall Street is thinking, how you can profit from a Trump presidency. And number three, I want to go over what does this mean for the Federal Reserve Bank, because the Fed is meeting today on November 7th, and they're going to make a decision on what to do with interest rates. But first, I have a little request from you, which is if you are a long-term investor, I don't want you to invest for election cycles. Instead, I want you to invest for the long term. That's where the real wealth is built. Now, new presidential administrations can create shifts in government spending. Those can create opportunities for those of you that are a little bit more sophisticated investors. So if you are just a long-term investor and you're investing in things like the S&P 500, none of this matters. But if you want to look for more specific market trends, more specific government shifts, and how those create unique investment opportunities, well, I'm hosting a free and live workshop on November 19th at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, where I'm going to be going over different ways that you can see government shifts from a Trump presidency. It is going to be going over different things that President Trump says that he wants to be investing in, where he wants to spend more government money, and how those can create opportunities in the markets. So if you want to join me, it's a free and live workshop, and I have the link for you to join down in the description below. Now, jumping into this. What we saw happen yesterday is we saw the Dow Jones jump up by more than 1,000 points. The S&P jumped up by almost 2% along with the NASDAQ. The Bitcoin broke a record, but we also saw the 10-year Treasury rise. And the reason why you want to pay attention to the 10-year Treasury is because that plays an impact on the mortgage rate you pay, that plays an impact on the car loan rate that you get, and that plays an impact on the interest rate that banks have to pay when they go out and borrow money. And so the reason why that matters is because when you see the 10-year Treasury rise, the thing that impacts is the cost of borrowing debt. Now, the Federal Reserve Bank is going to be meeting today on November 7th, and the markets have pretty much priced in a 99 to 100% chance that the Federal Reserve Bank is going to cut interest rates by 0.25%, meaning 25 basis points. And many people are hoping that if the Fed cuts rates, that getting a new mortgage or refinance is going to get cheaper. But when you see 10-year yields, the 10-year Treasury yield rise, that kind of fights it in the opposite direction. So even if the Federal Reserve Bank goes out and cuts interest rates, unless we see the 10-year Treasury yield fall, it is going to be difficult to see the real mortgage rate or car loan rate or business loan rate fall. That's what you want to pay attention to. Now, more specifically, let's get into some of the things that Trump has talked about, because Trump has talked about deregulating certain industries, for example, the financial services industry. If you have been subscribed to Market Briefs Pro, one of the things that we talked about last month is that Trump said that he wants to deregulate the financial services industry. And what we saw happen yesterday is that the ETFs, a couple ETFs in the financial services industry jumped up by 7 to 12% on the news that Donald Trump is going to win the White House, or is going to be the president starting 2025. In addition to that, what we also saw is that Donald Trump has also been talking about potentially privatizing Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And because of that, we saw those stocks also rally by more than 30% each. Now, some people have criticized that, saying that if you privatize Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, that can make getting a mortgage a little bit more expensive, but we'll see what actually happens. But the things that I want you to pay attention to is that on the economic side, there are 5 main things that I want to highlight that Trump says that he wants to do. Number 1 is he's been talking about tariffs. Number 2 is been talking about deregulating oil and gas and financial services industries. Number 3, he wants to invest in the military and defense. Number 4, he wants to make changes in taxes. And number 5, he's been talking about deporting illegal immigrants. Starting with tariffs. We'll see what ends up happening with tariffs, because there's obviously a lot of controversy around the idea of tariffs. But the idea behind tariffs is, number 1, to bring jobs back into the United States. So if you are a car manufacturer and you're building your cars in Mexico, you're going to be fined if you do that, essentially. Now, the goal with this is to bring those manufacturing jobs back to the United States. But there's a consequence to this, just like anything else. Because if you bring those jobs back to the United States, that means you have to pay USA employees. And USA employees are more expensive than a Mexican employee in Mexico because the cost of labor in the United States is higher. But this is where, now, if the cost of producing these vehicles go up, how will people be able to afford them? And this is where Trump says, number two, to make energy costs cheaper. He wants to deregulate oil and gas and the financial services industry. And so if you deregulate oil and gas, his goal is to make energy costs cheaper, gas cheaper. And it's not just your cost to fill up a tank of gas, because energy is used on everything. Every single business has to use energy. Every single company uses energy to transport products. So if the cost of energy goes down because you increase the supply of energy, well, that could potentially reduce the cost of certain or many items. That's where Trump says that even if tariffs make the prices of things go up, you'll make up for that cost through the deregulation of oil and gas. Plus, it would bring more jobs back to the United States. Of course, we don't know what's exactly going to happen. I'm just letting you know what some of his proposals are on the economic side of things. Third, he's also been vocal about investing in our military. Now, what does that mean more specifically? If you're investing in the military, that means that you have to produce more artillery, you have to produce more bullets, you have to produce more guns, you have to produce more tanks, you have to produce more planes. That means the aerospace and defense companies that are producing those products could receive bigger and more contracts from the government, because those things have to be paid for by somebody. And if the government is investing in the military, that could potentially mean that those companies, those defense companies, those aerospace companies could see more checks or larger checks from the government. Again, we will see what happens, but this is what Trump is saying right now. Number four, he's been talking about taxes. Now, I just made a video where I talked about the IRS's tax plan for 2025. This is not going to impact that, because President Trump will enter office in 2025, which means if he makes amendments to taxes, those won't go into effect until 2026. So what will happen with taxes? We will ultimately see what happens, but Trump has talked about cutting taxes for pretty much everybody. That's what he has said. He wants to cut taxes for the middle class through the form of potentially removing taxes on tips, potentially removing taxes on overtime, potentially cutting the tax rate. We'll see what ends up getting approved. He's also talked about potentially cutting corporate taxes or keeping corporate taxes low. The reason why is because when Trump was in office last term, he passed what was called the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act reduced the tax rates and reduced the tax brackets, the percentage, on majority of America. And that tax cut is set to expire at the end of 2025. So at the end of 2025, if the Tax Cut and Jobs Act expires and nothing else changes, that would mean that in 2026, your tax rate for pretty much everybody would go up, unless there is something that is implemented in 2025. And this is where Trump says that he wants to make some changes. What are those changes actually going to look like? Well, you would imagine that at the very least, he would want to extend the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, but he's also been vocal about potentially increasing the tax cuts. So again, we will see what that looks like. We'll keep you updated here on YouTube and on Market Briefs, which is my free financial newsletter, but we will see what that actually looks like. The fifth thing that he talks about economically, which is a little bit of a not economic thing, but I do want to talk about it here because he's been talking about deporting many illegal immigrants from an economic perspective. And what he means by that, and what he says, is that we have seen a large influx of illegal immigrants come into the United States. Now, these immigrants are people who spend money. But what he's been saying is that there's a cost to service those illegal immigrants, especially if the governments are funding those illegal immigrants. They're paying for housing, they're paying for their food, they're paying for whatever. That's number one. Number two is, if these illegal immigrants are getting money from governments, state governments, to then buy housing, then that lowers the supply of housing for the citizens of the United States. And this is where what Trump says is if you remove the illegal immigrants, that does a couple things. Number one, that's going to ease the burden on the United States government and states governments, because that means they have to then provide less subsidies to those illegal immigrants. And number two, it would also reduce the demand for things like housing, because then you have less illegal immigrants that you have to compete against to get an apartment, to get a house. Again, what will actually be approved? What will actually happen? We will see once 2025 rolls around. But those are the 5 main things economically that Trump has been talking about. Now, again, that's why I'm hosting my workshop on November 19th at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, which is a free workshop, because what I want to go over in that workshop is for those of you that are stock market investor, I want to go over the industries that Trump has been talking about. For example, oil and gas, for example, financial services, for example, private prisons, how these things could be impacted by a Trump presidency. That way, for those of you that are stock market investors, I want you to understand what's going on. But I want to end with that same note that I said in the beginning. For the average person, if you're just investing in the markets, what's happening in the White House does not matter. It creates a government shift, which is fine, but at the end of the day, what we have seen for the last 100 years is under a Republican president, we have seen the stock market go up and we have seen it go down. Under Democratic presidents, we have seen the stock market go up and we have seen it go down. So if you're just investing in the economy, none of this stuff matters. You just keep doing your thing. Didn't matter who won. I was going to be in the office regardless of who won. I got to still go to work. I got to still keep doing my thing, and you do too. So now that the election's over, time to get focused back in your house and understand now, how are you going to keep working to invest your money, pay down your debt, and build your wealth regardless of what's happening in the White House. And for those of you that want to find the opportunities through the government shift, well, that's what I'm going to be talking about on my workshop. And with that, I will see you on YouTube tomorrow.